Alright, we are back with yet another series. I personally really enjoyed being lazy and literally just talking about the story of a manga like I did with All You Need Is Kill, and I thought I would do something a little similar for yet another series. So while I was perusing manga to read, I came across Parasyte Reversi, and while I won't do that, this did give me the feeling of wanting to revisit an old semi-classic. Although Parasyte first came out in the late 1980s, it has a slightly more recent feel to it thanks to the 2014 anime. As such, there's probably a good set of fresh eyes on the series as well as older glazed eyes. Jokes aside, I remember this being good overall, so I'm interested to see if my opinion has changed much since I first laid my eyes upon it. So Parasyte was a manga that first began back in 1988 and was written by Hitoshi Iwaka, and if you heard of him elsewhere, it's probably from his other ongoing but on a hiatus series, History. Having read both, you can almost tell that Hitoshi has a very strange outlook at the world, and in some sense the two characters are quite similar. I like both series. If you end up being interested in Parasyte, I do recommend giving History a look. They are both a little fatalistic, and that's something that's a little rare in terms of manga. Let's start with Parasyte though. Note, there's a ton of body dysmorphia and body shape-shifting, so if you're uncomfortable with that, feel free to stop watching, but do know I will try my best to find some of the less uncomfortable parts to put up on screen. Today we'll be going through the unofficially named Silent Invasion arc, which is roughly from chapter 1 to somewhere midway chapter 9. The manga starts out with a mix of philosophy and exposition and introduces us to these tiny egg-like things who seem to fall down, raining from the sky, and from then hatch these worm-like creatures. These worms are trying to crawl into people's bloodstreams to then reach their brains and take control of the body. You might be wondering why everyone seems to just be letting these guys crawl into them, and for the most part, as it's nighttime, most are asleep when all of this is happening. So who would be awake when they should be asleep? Definitely our main protagonist, the teenager Shinichi Izumi, who was sort of dozing off, listening to music, but was actually able to jump into action when he noticed a little crawler trying to move up his arm, his right arm more specifically, to climb his bloodstream. So with some quick thinking, he grabs a cord and tries to stop the advance of the worm by blocking the blood flow for a bit. We see what happens to those who weren't able to do what Izumi did, such as this random character called Asako, who had just been taken over by one of these worm aliens. We see it walking up to the original being's wife, and his head just opens up to this tentacle monster and it chomps on the lady. I don't know if you guys saw the movie, the Marvel movie Captain Marvel, or just read Marvel comic books in general, but if you guys remember the Flurkin cat, who were these normal looking cats, usually whose head can open up, revealing these horrific tentacle monsters. I wonder if Parasyte had any influence on those creatures' design, but either way, it's neat. Luckily for Shinichi, sometimes referred to as Shinji, or Shinji, I think it's Shinji, sometimes referred to as Shinji, he seems to be overall okay, but we see him change a little, or at least the hand from last night seems to be moving independently from his thoughts. This culminates in a situation where Shinji ended up being able to take down half a dozen stereotypical Japanese bullies, all without him really doing anything. Finally getting home, Shinji resolves to find out what is happening to him, so he pulls out a knife and resolves himself to get stabbed, but as he swings and as it automatically dodges, eyes and a mouth start forming, as well as these tiny arms who begins talking to him. By the next day, the hand has pretty much become its own being. It's went through dozens of books, and for the most part, we start learning a little more about Shinji's new relationship with Migi, the name that he gave his right arm / alien thing. While all this is happening, we have to remember that there were actually quite a few alien things that rained down. So what's happening to all the others? Well, it turns out that cases like Shinji are the minority, and I mean really minority. If we're talking about success rates, the takeover from the part of the worm things is definitely in the high 90%. And for those who do manage to take over the human bodies, we see them follow their primal instincts, which is to blend into human society and quietly try and consume other human beings. After some time passes, Shinji has pretty much accepted his new reality, and Migi and Shinji form a quote-unquote working relationship. Migi is naturally curious and tries to absorb as much information and knowledge as possible, which Shinji provides to him through various books. On the other hand, Migi does inform Shinji on his kind and what he can and cannot do for Shinji. Let's start with the background information. Migi is a kind of mysterious life form from where? We do not know. What we do know is that they have an innate need for nutrients to survive. While for the most part they do decide on human meat, it actually isn't necessary, but humans are simply a preference and it sort of gives them a craving. Maybe because we taste a little better, but I can't know that for sure. Miji's kind have to find a host relatively quickly from the worm phase, and they actually can link to more than just humans, such as the example where we see a dog having been taken over by one. But their intellect is sort of connected to what kind of creature they took over, and most of Miji's kind would consider that dog / not dog a failure. On the other hand, get it? Other hand? God, I'm good. Anyway, on the other hand, Miji could also be considered a failure as he was unable to take control of Shinji's brain. It turns out that these creatures all have different personalities. Some are hungry for knowledge, like Miji, while others are more literally hungry, like most of Miji's kind. So in that sense, Shinji did luck out. Having Miji as your arm has its perks and downsides. Miji can actually react to things at a faster speed than Shinji can, even when Shinji is unaware, like when he's asleep or just simply looking away. Overall, Shinji's physical abilities have improved, and if any of you have watched the Tobey Maguire first Spider-Man movie, they even do that thing where he doesn't need his glasses in the anime, which is kind of funny. That said, most of that power is sort of focused into his right arm. That right arm does have superhuman strength, while most of his body is just, peak human strength, like what an Olympic athlete would have, and can even change its composition depending on the scenario. The hand can stretch, bend, or even change itself into a blade-like form to cut things apart. The downside though is that you pretty much lose control of that hand when Miji is awake. Miji could shoplift, for example, without you knowing, or grope someone without your consent, and I suppose the other person's consent. Shinji's appetite also increased. I imagine this is to compensate for the higher calorie usage, because at the very least he's now sharing his body. Back to the other creatures, they seem to still be getting their bearings because they all sort of fell down from the sky at the same time, and some have in fact gone on killing sprees. Some try to seek out for ways to become even more powerful. Shinji actually gets attacked by one, trying to convince Miji to fuse with his host, but our two protagonists manage to overcome him. Although there were a few characters introduced, most didn't matter apart from his parents, which are sort of self-explanatory: Satomi Murano, Shinji's female classmate, and obvious romantic interest, and one more. Shinji sort of discovers that he can sense parasites when they're nearby, and this comes into play when he discovers that one of his new female teachers is in fact a parasite. And the kicker, she knows that Shinji is a parasite too. Granted, she has yet to find out if he's a complete or a partial host. His teacher, named Reiko, is upfront with Shinji. Much like Miji, she doesn't have much of a drive for human meat, only really consuming the bare minimum needed. In fact, she's more interested in human psychology and physiology. She sees humans more as a research subject than anything else. She even goes as far as to attempt to procreate with another male parasite, and confirms that she is indeed pregnant, and that she's done all this just to really find out what will be born. The baby daddy is Mr. A, who entertained Reiko's idea, but is definitely more like a traditional bloodthirsty parasite. He's so bloodthirsty, in fact, that literally the next chapter from his introduction, Mr. A proceeds to attack Shinji and Reiko's school, going on a killing spree. Although not official or anything, Shinji does feel like he is the protector of the school, and as every other student is evacuating, he goes back to confront Mr. A. The battle is actually quite cool, because while on paper Mr. A should be the more formidable fighter, he's a complete parasite. Because his attack pattern is quite simple, really just flaying around his blade tentacles, Miji could actually match him, while Shinji sneaks up and pierces him with a sharp death's leg. While he's limping away, he's lured by Reiko into walking into an explosion, thus killing him. If this manga is to be believed though, what is hilarious is the priority of Japanese high schools. While there was just the equivalent of a school shooter just days earlier, the school's administration seems to be more heated on the fact that Meiko was a now single pregnant woman. Reiko responds by straight up quitting the job, as the position was really just another social experiment for her. For a bit, Shinji considered hunting her down, fearing that she would become a danger, but Miji correctly advises him of the contrary, as unlike Mr. A, Reiko is an actually intelligent and calculating individual. The last bit of this arc sort of concludes Reiko's story, as she pretty much packs up and disappears into the wind. And that, my friends, the first arc, and by extension the first episode on Parasyte. Like most first episode, this had a ton of exposition dump, but I think overall it is a neat premise. There has so far been a few revelations on what these parasites can do, and honestly the shapeshifting part makes this really terrifying in its own little ways. For those considering picking up Parasyte, I do recommend it. The series itself isn't that long, and if the art or something feels old to you, the 2014 anime actually is an interesting remaster slash remake, and I think it does a good job telling the story overall, with slight cosmetic and flavor changes. But that's it for us. We'll be sticking with Parasyte for the foreseeable future, and we'll go from there. And that's all from me, Yuan from Manga4Dummies, and I appreciate any of the usual YouTube things that I'm supposed to ask for. Anyway, have a nice one, guys.